Welcome to True Crime Threads. A mother's obsession leads to tragic consequences. Everything seemed perfect in the Henderson household. Diane Henderson, a devoted mother, had always been there for her daughter, Nora, through every step of her life. Nora was 18 now, an intelligent young woman on the brink of adulthood, ready to leave the nest and start a life of her own. Diane had always prided herself on being a supportive and loving mother, but when Nora introduced her to Walter, her life would change in ways she never expected. Walter was 20, charming and charismatic, with a quiet confidence that drew people in. From the first moment Diane met him, she could see why Nora had fallen for him. He was polite, respectful, and clearly cared about her daughter deeply. He had a certain maturity about him that was unusual for someone so young, and Diane couldn't help but feel a little envious of the connection he shared with Nora. But, she reassured herself, it was just a phase every mother worries about their daughter's first serious relationship. She told herself that, as long as he treated Nora well, she would be happy for them. However, what started as a simple motherly approval soon began to evolve into something else. Diane couldn't shake the way Walter made her feel. His compliments, though always kind and respectful, stirred something within her. She noticed the way he would sometimes linger a little longer when talking to her, the way his gaze would seem to hold hers just a moment too long. It was innocent at first, she thought. He was just being polite, nothing more. But over time, Diane began to find herself thinking about him when he wasn't around. She told herself it was nothing. After all, Walter was like a son to her. Nora had always been her world, and there was no place for anything that would jeopardize that. Yet, every time Walter came over to visit, Diane found herself doing little things she hadn't before. She made sure to offer him drinks, snacks, or anything else he might need. She found herself tidying the house more meticulously when she knew he was coming, making sure everything was just right. She convinced herself it was just being a good hostess. But deep down, she felt a strange rush every time he came over. The attention she gave him, the little moments where their eyes would meet, or he would smile warmly at her, it made her feel special, noticed in ways she hadn't been in a long time. There was an undeniable connection that grew between them, though neither of them acknowledged it out loud. Diane was careful, of course, not to cross any boundaries. She loved her daughter, and she never wanted to do anything that would hurt her. But it was impossible to ignore the subtle ways she sought out Walter's company, whether it was lingering by the door to chat when he arrived or casually offering to help him with things that didn't really require help. It was as though her maternal instincts had merged with something else, something darker and more unsettling. And then there were the moments when Nora wasn't around. Diane found herself watching Walter more closely, paying attention to the way he interacted with others, especially women. It seemed innocent enough, but Diane's mind began to race. Was he flirting with them? Was he interested in someone else? There were moments when she felt irrationally jealous of the women who shared space with him, even if it was just in passing. She convinced herself it didn't mean anything, that she was just overthinking. But the more she saw him, the more her thoughts began to spiral. She told herself she was being ridiculous. He was just her daughter's boyfriend, nothing more. But even as she tried to push those feelings aside, the reality was clear. Diane's affection for Walter had grown into something she didn't quite understand, and it was beginning to consume her. It didn't take long for Diane to notice the first signs of trouble. As the weeks passed, she found herself resenting Nora more and more, not for anything specific, but for the way her daughter's relationship with Walter seemed to be pushing her out. The bond she had always shared with Nora felt like it was slipping away, replaced by something that Diane couldn't control or understand. Nora had always been her world, her purpose, and now Walter was taking up space in her life, occupying the time that used to belong solely to Diane. At first, it was subtle. Nora would spend hours on the phone with Walter, laughing and talking about nothing in particular, and Diane would find herself standing at the doorway, listening to the sound of her daughter's voice, wishing it was directed toward her. Even simple family dinners, once a time for close conversation, had become awkward. Walter was always present, and though he was polite and kind, there was a sense that he was more of a fixture than a guest. Diane couldn't help but feel a cold distance growing between herself and her daughter, and it hurt. But what hurt even more was how she began to see Walter differently. Where once she had admired his charm, she now found herself analyzing every word he said and every glance he gave her daughter. It wasn't just about his looks or the way he treated Nora anymore. Diane was beginning to fixate on the small details, the way he tilted his head when he spoke to her, how his hand would graze hers when passing her a drink, the way his smile lingered just a little too long. These seemingly innocent gestures made Diane feel something that she couldn't fully comprehend. It was a feeling that gnawed at her, one she didn't want to admit but couldn't deny. One evening, when Nora had gone out with her friends, Diane decided to take matters into her own hands. She had an excuse: she had offered to pick up some paperwork from Walter's workplace, a simple errand that she was sure would take only a few minutes. But as soon as she walked into the small, quiet office, she felt a strange, unsettling tension in the air. Walter was at his desk, but there was another woman standing near him. She was younger, with long dark hair and a bright, friendly smile that seemed to make Walter laugh a little too easily. Diane stood back, watching from a distance as they spoke. She noticed how Walter's body language shifted as he interacted with the woman. His posture relaxed, his eyes softened, and there was something in his tone that made Diane's stomach churn. It was an innocent conversation, nothing more than a quick exchange, but for Diane it felt like a betrayal. She tried to convince herself that it was nothing, that Walter was just being polite, that he wasn't flirting, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. Why was he so comfortable with this woman? Why did it seem so effortless? Diane could feel herself spiraling, her thoughts racing as she tried to make sense of the feelings that were consuming her. She had never seen Nora react to Walter the way this woman did. In fact, no one seemed to look at Walter the way Diane had begun to. When she finally left, her mind was reeling. She felt nauseous, as though she had stumbled upon a secret she wasn't meant to know. The next few days were filled with restless nights, each moment of silence in her home filled with tension. Diane couldn't shake the image of Walter and the woman in the office, the way they had exchanged looks and laughter that seemed too intimate. She had seen it all before: the way a man could become infatuated with someone who wasn't his partner, the way a relationship could slip from under your fingers without even realizing it. But she told herself to be rational. This was just a moment of jealousy, she reasoned. It was natural for a mother to feel protective of her daughter. It didn't mean anything. But the gnawing feeling, the sense of being displaced by someone who wasn't even part of the family, continued to eat away at her. Diane began to notice more and more how Walter would choose his words around her, how he would sometimes avoid eye contact, as though he was uncomfortable. He didn't know, she thought, how deeply she felt about him, how much his presence was beginning to mean to her. She had to protect what she had left. She had to make sure that he would never leave, that he wouldn't slip through her fingers like everything else. It wasn't just about Nora anymore. It was about Walter, and she couldn't stop thinking about him. As weeks passed, Diane's obsession with Walter grew uncontrollably. What began as an innocent fascination now seemed to consume her every waking thought. She couldn't escape the sensation that he was the only person who truly understood her, the only person who paid attention to her in a way that made her feel special. It was as though he was the missing piece in her life, filling a void that she hadn't even realized was there. She told herself that her feelings were just an extension of her concern for Nora's happiness, but deep down, she knew it was something darker, something far more dangerous. Diane started to manipulate situations so that she could spend more time with Walter, even when Nora wasn't around. She began finding excuses to drive him places, offering to take him home after work or drop him off at the grocery store. It was innocent enough on the surface, she thought, but each ride felt like an intimate moment. She paid close attention to the way Walter responded to her, whether he seemed at ease, or if he pulled away ever so slightly, when she spoke a little too closely, or laughed a little too loudly at his jokes. She found herself reading into every small interaction, interpreting them as signs that Walter was beginning to feel something for her too. In truth, Walter was polite, but he never seemed to encourage her advances. Still, Diane's mind was convinced that there was something between them, something he wasn't willing to admit. The more she became involved in Walter's life, the more Nora seemed distant. The bond they had once shared, the late-night talks and mother-daughter moments, seemed to vanish with each passing day. Nora was always with Walter, wrapped up in their own world, and Diane's sense of being left behind deepened. What started as occasional jealousy grew into a full-fledged resentment. Every time Nora mentioned Walter, talked about their future plans, or laughed at one of his jokes, Diane felt an icy pang in her chest. Why couldn't Nora see what was happening? Why couldn't she understand that Walter belonged with her mother, not with her? One evening, Diane's suspicions reached a new height. She overheard a conversation between Nora and Walter. They were sitting in the living room, laughing about their plans for the upcoming weekend. Nora was excited, planning a getaway with Walter, just the two of them. Diane stood by the door, unnoticed, as she listened to their conversation. At first, she told herself it wasn't a big deal, just a simple trip, a chance for Nora to spend quality time with her boyfriend. But the more Diane listened, the more she felt her anger and frustration building. It was more than just a weekend away. It was a sign that Nora was pulling away, making plans that didn't involve her mother, carving out a life that Diane wasn't a part of. As the conversation continued, Diane's thoughts spiraled. She could feel a knot forming in her stomach, her pulse quickening. What were they talking about that she didn't know? Why was Walter always so eager to make plans with Nora, but so distant when it came to her? Was he starting to grow tired of Nora, just as she feared? Or was he already looking for someone else, someone who wasn't as close to him as Nora was? Diane could almost feel the walls closing in. She had to do something, she thought. She couldn't just sit back and watch as Walter slipped further away from her. The jealousy, once a quiet whisper in her mind, had now become a loud, persistent voice, urging her to take action. If she could just get closer to him, show him how much she cared, how much she understood him, maybe things would be different. Maybe Walter would finally see that she was the one who truly mattered. She began planning, scheming in the quiet of the night when no one else was around. Diane had to make sure she didn't lose him. If she couldn't have him, no one could. And the more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that Nora was standing in the way of something that was meant to be. Diane's behavior became increasingly erratic as her obsession with Walter deepened. She had crossed the line from being a concerned mother to someone whose fixation on her daughter's boyfriend had taken over every aspect of her life. Walter had become the center of her thoughts, and the more she focused on him, the more she could not tolerate the thought of him spending time with Nora without her involvement. It was as though Walter was a puzzle she couldn't quite solve, a mystery that refused to let her go. And yet, the more she tried to get closer to him, the more distant he seemed to grow. She found herself scheming to insert herself into his life, making herself indispensable. It started with small gestures, offering to help with tasks that Walter never asked for, like running errands or picking up a few things he needed for his apartment. She even made him lunch a few times, subtly pushing herself into his daily routine. She believed that, by showing him just how much she cared, she could erase the boundaries between them. But Walter, though polite and appreciative, never seemed to reciprocate. He was kind, but distant, never allowing her advances to go too far. Still, Diane refused to take this as a sign to back off. Instead, she convinced herself that he was just being cautious, that he didn't realize what she had to offer. She continued to find ways to show him her affection, to be the one who was always there for him. Even when Walter's behavior began to grow increasingly uncomfortable, Diane ignored the red flags. He would often become quiet when she would show up unexpectedly or make excuses about being busy when she suggested spending time together. But Diane refused to acknowledge these signs, telling herself that Walter was simply being shy or that he was caught up in his own world. She told herself that, given time, he would see her as more than just a motherly figure. He would realize they were meant to be together. The situation came to a head when Walter, seemingly worn down by Diane's constant attention, started avoiding her more intentionally. He was spending more time with Nora, as couples do, but he wasn't always kind when Diane would ask to see him. She noticed the coldness creeping into his voice, the way he began to make excuses to leave early when she invited him over. He no longer responded to her texts as quickly, and their conversations grew shorter and more strained. Diane could feel herself slipping further away from him, but she wasn't ready to let go, not when she had come so far, not when she was so close. In the midst of this, a new opportunity presented itself, an opening to manipulate Walter into relying on her even more. Diane learned that Walter had been having some trouble with his finances. His job wasn't paying as well as he'd hoped, and he had been struggling to make ends meet. Diane saw this as her chance to step in. She offered to help him with his financial troubles, convinced that, once he saw her as someone who could solve his problems, he would begin to see her as more than just a supportive figure. She wasn't just offering him money, she was offering him herself, her presence in his life. Surely he would understand the depth of her devotion, and he would come to see that she could be the person he truly needed. But instead of seeing her as a savior, Walter only grew more uncomfortable. Diane's persistence became overbearing, and her attempts to get closer to him began to feel like a trap. Walter pulled away even further, becoming increasingly agitated with Diane's attempts to help. He began making excuses to avoid seeing her, and Diane could sense that something was wrong, though she refused to admit it. He no longer seemed to appreciate her gestures. Instead, he seemed repelled by them. Diane's heart sank as she watched the last remnants of the connection she thought they shared disappear. She couldn't accept it. The more Walter distanced himself, the more desperate she became. She needed him to understand, to see that her love for him wasn't just an infatuation, it was something deeper, something that no one else could offer. She began to spiral, her obsession with Walter now consuming her completely. She couldn't just watch him slip away, not when everything she had done was meant to bring them closer. If he wouldn't see reason, if he couldn't understand how much she needed him, then Diane decided that she would make him see it no matter the cost. Diane's mind was racing, consumed by the overwhelming need to keep Walter in her life. The small, seemingly insignificant moments that once gave her comfort had turned into a constant source of anxiety. Every glance, every quiet conversation, felt like it was slipping through her fingers. She couldn't stand the thought of Walter pulling away, of him choosing Nora over her. In her mind, he belonged to her, and she would do whatever it took to ensure he realized that. The tension reached a boiling point one fateful evening. Nora had planned a surprise dinner for Walter, something she'd been looking forward to for weeks. Diane had heard the excitement in her daughter's voice as she made the arrangements, and a wave of jealousy and anger washed over her. The thought of Walter being so wrapped up in Nora, sharing such intimate moments with her, made Diane feel like an outsider in her own home. She had tried everything, being helpful, supportive, even offering him financial assistance, but none of it had worked. Walter was slipping away, and Diane could feel it like a physical ache in her chest. That night, as Nora prepared for her dinner date with Walter, Diane made her decision. She had tried to play the role of the caring mother, but that was no longer enough. She had to make him see her, to make him understand how much he meant to her. She had already spent too many nights in torment, watching him drift further and further from her. This time, she wasn't going to let him slip away. She waited until Nora was out, leaving the house for her dinner with Walter. Diane quietly followed her daughter, keeping a careful distance. She wasn't sure what she was hoping for, maybe just a glimpse of the two of them together, maybe to confront Walter and tell him how she felt, but as she watched from the shadows, something dark and dangerous began to stir within her. The feeling of being invisible, of being replaced by Nora, overwhelmed her. She could feel herself spiraling, her grip on reality loosening with every step she took. When she finally arrived at the restaurant, she stood outside, watching them through the window. Walter was laughing, his face soft and relaxed as he looked at Nora, completely at ease. Nora was glowing, clearly happy, and the sight filled Diane with a mixture of rage and desperation. This was the moment that would change everything. Diane pushed open the door to the restaurant, her breath quickening. She approached their table, her heart pounding in her chest. Walter looked up in surprise as she stood there, but Nora immediately noticed the tension in her mother's face. Before she could react, Diane spoke, her voice low but filled with an unmistakable intensity. "I need to talk to you, Walter," she said, her words heavy with an unspoken threat. Nora looked confused, but Walter's face immediately hardened. Diane could see the discomfort in his eyes, the way he shifted in his seat. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't know how to handle it. Diane leaned closer, her eyes locked on his. "You've been avoiding me," she said softly, though her tone was sharp. "Why, Walter? Why don't you see it? Why don't you understand what we have?" Walter's face went pale, and Nora, now realizing something was terribly wrong, stood up. But Diane didn't let her speak. Her mind was racing, consumed by the overwhelming need to make Walter see her, to make him understand that she was the one who could offer him everything he needed. Before anyone could stop her, Diane reached out and grabbed Walter's arm, pulling him toward her. Her grip was firm, desperate, and her fingers dug into his skin. Nora screamed, trying to pull Diane away, but Diane's strength was fueled by something more than rage. It was fueled by her need to possess Walter, to make him hers. In that moment, Walter finally pulled away from Diane, his face filled with fear and confusion. He stumbled back, shocked by the suddenness of her actions. Nora, in tears, stood between them, trying to shield him from her mother's grasp. "I love you," Walter, Diane whispered, her voice breaking as the words spilled out. "I always have." But Walter, terrified and shaken, could only look at her with disbelief. He took a step back, shaking his head, and whispered, "This isn't right. You're not thinking clearly." The sound of police sirens grew louder, and within moments the restaurant staff had called for help. Diane's obsession had pushed her to the breaking point, and now there was no turning back. As the officers arrived and escorted her away from the scene, she realized that she had lost everything: her daughter's trust, her relationship with Walter, and the fragile grip on reality she had once held. The path she had chosen had led to this tragic moment, and in her quest to keep Walter in her life, she had destroyed everything she had once held dear.